Okay, ready for this? We're going deep today. Diving into, honestly, it's a tough one. We're talking about divorce, but specifically navigating it as an autistic parent. It's heavy stuff, no doubt. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. We've got some really amazing resources to share. Blog posts, articles, some titles, really, they just grab you. It's like instantly you get that feeling that, okay, I'm not the only one going through this.
That's really the core of what these deep dives are all about, isn't it?
Hmm.
We're not lawyers or anything, so no
Hmm.
legal advice here. But what we can do is help unpack everything else. The emotions, the practical stuff that comes with being autistic and going through this huge life change. And yeah, ultimately, how to find a way to heal and move forward.
Exactly. And I think it's important to just say it up front. Divorce is rough for anyone. But if you're on the autism spectrum and you might experience things, emotions more intensely or maybe process them differently, well, it can feel like it's a whole other level of complicated.
And one of the biggest things is divorce just throws everything up in the air. Routines, stability out the window. It's all about change and uncertainty, and for someone who really thrives on predictability, like a lot of autistic people do, that can be incredibly disorienting.
Absolutely. Then you add in all the social stuff in communication, dealing with your ex, maybe lawyers, trying to explain things to family and friends. It's like a recipe for sensory overload.
Oh, for sure. Like everything's dialed up to 11. And speaking of sensory overload, I mean, for anyone who's not familiar, that's when your senses just get bombarded. Too much input, bright lights, loud noises, strong smells, even just social interactions can be too much. And it can lead to, well, anxiety, meltdowns, even physical discomfort. So yeah, try going through all the divorce stuff while dealing with that.
It really puts it all in perspective. Finding support during that time, that feels essential. Whether it's therapy, a trusted friend, family, or finding support online, having that safe space to process it all is huge.
Absolutely crucial. And as you start working through those initial feelings, I mean, real life comes knocking, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you have kids. Co-parenting, that's a whole other landscape to navigate.
And from what I've been reading, communication, like clear, straightforward communication with your ex, seems to be the key to making co-parenting work.
It really is. And, that autistic tendency to be direct, it can actually be a real advantage here. You're less likely to get tangled up in hints or like unspoken expectations, the kind of things that can cause problems down the line.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. So it's almost like a communication style that maybe in other situations isn't always seen positively, but here it becomes a strength.
Right. You're saying what you mean, meaning what you say, less room for misinterpretations.
Mm.
And while we're talking about communication, consistency for your child is so important too. Between households, like we've said, routines, predictability, those are often super comforting for autistic individuals, especially kids.
Yeah, so even though their family structure is changing, keeping some things consistent, like bedtimes, routines around meals, those can make a huge difference. It's about creating some kind of stability in the middle of all the upheaval.
Exactly. And this leads us to, I think, another critical piece of the puzzle. Advocating for your child's needs through this whole process. This can be a lot for any parent, but especially for an autistic parent who might already be feeling overloaded.
Absolutely. You're dealing with your own emotional roller coaster. And then on top of that, you've got this responsibility to make sure your child's support systems, their therapy, education, social circles, all of that stay intact.
It's a heavy load. And honestly, knowledge is power here. You need to know your child's needs inside and out, their strengths, their challenges, and be ready to advocate for them, even when you're facing pushback. Or maybe people just don't get it.
So that could be anything from making sure their therapies continue to explaining how they communicate to teachers or new partners, anyone new in their life, building that circle of support that really understands them.
Exactly. It goes beyond just the basics. It's about protecting their emotional well-being, too. Making sure they have a space to express their feelings. Even if those feelings are hard or confusing, that's so important.
And this feels like a good bridge to the next part of this whole journey, healing and growth. Divorce is tough, no question, but it can also be a chance for positive change for you and for your child, like finding a silver lining.
I love that, finding the silver lining. And to really nurture that, we have to talk about self-care. This is super important for everyone, but especially for autistic individuals who might be more prone to burnout. Can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Right. So practically speaking, what does self-care actually look like in this situation?
It's about making a conscious effort to do things that bring you joy, that help you relax. That might be sensory activities that de-stress you, recharge your batteries. For some people, that's nature, music, creative outlets. It's really about tuning into your own sensory needs and honoring them, even in the middle of everything else going on.
It's like rediscovering those things that bring you peace, even when things are tough. Speaking of rediscovering, we're reading some research about the potential benefits of divorce for autistic individuals. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. Might surprise some people, honestly. Some experts think that for certain autistic individuals, divorce can actually lead to less stress and anxiety over time. Now, that might sound counterintuitive because obviously going through it is stressful. But
For a lot of autistic people, navigating the social expectations of, say, a neurotypical marriage can be a source of constant tension, especially if communication styles are totally different or there's not a lot of understanding about sensory needs and sensitivities. It's like you're constantly negotiating, which can be exhausting.
exactly. So removing yourself from that environment, even though it's painful in the moment, in the long run, it can create space to be more yourself,
Mm.
express yourself more authentically. And that can lead to less stress, less anxiety.
So once the dust settles, you've got new routines, new boundaries, there's potential for relief, even a sense of freedom.
Exactly. And that freedom can carry over into co-parenting too. Outside of the marriage, you might find it's easier to communicate with your ex, honestly and directly, about your child's needs, without all the emotional baggage.
Cutting through the noise, focusing on what matters, your child.
You got it. Clarity and collaboration.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we're not saying divorce is a magic bullet. It's deeply personal, complex, and there's no one outcome for everyone. But it is important to recognize that there's not just one narrative.
For sure. And that's what makes exploring all these different perspectives so valuable. The more we understand the range of experiences, the better equipped we are to support ourselves and each other.
And that support can come in lots of forms. Individual therapy, support groups specifically for autistic parents, even online forums where you can find people who just get it. And don't forget self-advocacy. This is a time when you really need to put your own needs first, set those boundaries to protect your well-being.
Being assertive about how you communicate with your ex, making time to decompress, avoid sensory overload, anything that helps you recharge and cope.
Recognizing that self-care isn't selfish, it's essential, especially for autistic individuals who are more susceptible to burning out. And remember, self-care doesn't look the same for everyone.
It's about finding what really replenishes you, recharges you. For some, it might be diving into special interests, sensory activities they enjoy, or connecting with like-minded people online.
Exactly. And as you navigate this new chapter, remember, you are not alone. There are so many resources, so many communities out there dedicated to supporting autistic individuals and families. And speaking of resources, we do have a few that we think could be especially helpful, which we'll link in the episode description.
But before we get to those, you mentioned earlier that divorce can sometimes lead to a decrease in stress for autistic individuals. I'm really curious to hear more about the research behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. One study we found actually followed autistic adults for years after divorce. And they found that a lot of them reported feeling less stressed, less anxious compared to when they were married. And this wasn't just temporary, it seemed to last over time.
That's really significant. What were some of the things that seemed to contribute to those positive outcomes?
Well, a big one was being able to create a home environment that was really tailored to their sensory needs. Remember we talked about sensory overload? Imagine being able to control the lighting, the noise, the textures in your own space. That can be such a relief.
Yeah, you're no longer having to constantly negotiate or compromise on those things.
Exactly. And another thing that came up was the freedom to engage in special interests. No judgment, no interruptions. We know those can be so absorbing, so rewarding for autistic people, but sometimes they're misunderstood or even dismissed in neurotypical relationships.
So it's about having that space, that autonomy to pursue those passions without feeling like you have to explain or defend them.
Right. And it ties back to that idea of authenticity we were talking about before. Divorce, as hard as it is, can sometimes create the space for people to embrace their true selves, including their autistic identity, more fully.
That's powerful. It really changes the way we usually think about divorce, doesn't it? It suggests that for some, it can be a time for personal growth, self-discovery.
Absolutely. And that's a message I think we need to hear more of. Because even though divorce is hard, it doesn't have to define you. It can be a turning point, a chance to rewrite your story.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we're going to take a quick pause. But when we come back, we'll dig into some specific strategies for co-parenting as an autistic parent. So we're back. and ready to, well, to tackle some strategies for this whole co-parenting thing as an autistic parent. It can feel overwhelming, to say the least. But I think in going through these resources, we found some real nuggets, things that can make it hopefully smoother and maybe even a little less stressful.
Less stressful, yeah, I think that's definitely possible. And one thing that comes up a lot is the importance of boundaries, expectations, really, that you set with your ex right from the beginning,
Yeah.
especially when you're co-parenting with someone who maybe doesn't fully grasp the whole autism thing.
So it's like laying the groundwork for communication, collaboration, where everyone's needs are considered. But how do you even start doing that? Especially if there's still hurt feelings, resentment from the divorce.
It's tough, no doubt. But remember, this isn't about rehashing the past. It's about building a relationship that works for your child's sake. Sometimes that means putting your own feelings aside, focusing on the bigger picture.
That makes sense. So are there like concrete steps you can take to establish those boundaries, those expectations?
Well, one thing we see a lot is a written co-parenting agreement.
Yeah.
It can be formal, informal, whatever works. But the key is having something you can both refer to that outlines how you'll communicate, make decisions, even just the division of responsibilities.
Like a roadmap you can both follow to help avoid misunderstandings and conflicts later on.
Exactly. And within that agreement, you can address things that might be specific to you as an autistic parent, like maybe including stuff about keeping routines similar between households or making sure your child's sensory needs are met in both places.
Right, so you're proactively tackling potential problems, finding solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And while we're on the topic of communication, let's talk about how you communicate with your ex. Remember that whole directness thing we were talking about? Can be a real asset in co-parenting, but you got to be mindful of how it comes across to someone who's not neurodivergent.
Because what feels clear and straightforward to you might seem blunt or even insensitive to someone who's used to a more, I don't know, a more nuanced style of communication.
Exactly. So a little self-awareness and flexibility go a long way here. If you know your ex is sensitive to criticism, for example, maybe try framing your feedback or requests in a more positive way. Instead of "you're doing this wrong," it could be, "hey, I think it'd be really helpful for a child's name if we try this instead."
Just a slight change in wording, but it can make a big difference in how it's received.
Huge difference. It's
Hmm.
all about finding that way to communicate effectively, without starting a fight. Another thing that can be really helpful is being upfront about your own sensory needs and how they might affect your parenting.
Like telling your ex you need some quiet time after picking up your child from school just to decompress. Or maybe explaining that certain sounds or smells can be overwhelming for you.
Yeah, openness, honesty about your needs, it can create a much more understanding environment for co-parenting. And remember, it goes both ways. Just like you're trying to understand your ex, they need to try and understand you too.
Meeting in the middle. Recognizing you both want the same thing. What's best for your child.
Exactly. And sometimes you might need a little help. If communication keeps breaking down or setting those boundaries feels impossible, a family therapist who specializes in autism and divorce, they can be a lifesaver.
That neutral third party, helping you both see things from the other's perspective, coming up with strategies.
And they can also support your child, because they're going through their own stuff too.
Which brings us back to advocating for your child's needs. We've talked about the practical stuff, therapy, education. But what about their emotional well-being? How can you help them cope with all the changes, the anxiety that comes with divorce?
One of the most important things is just creating a safe space for them, where they can express whatever they're feeling. And remember, kids, they often communicate through behavior more than words. So watch for changes in their sleep, their eating, even how they play.
So if they're suddenly having more meltdowns or they're not interested in things they used to love, that could be a sign they're having a hard time processing everything.
Right. And it's important not to dismiss those feelings, even if they seem irrational or over the top. Kids experience divorce in their own way, and their feelings are valid.
So how do you validate those feelings without, encouraging negative behavior?
Good question. It's about finding that balance, empathy, and limits. You can acknowledge their sadness, their anger, without saying it's okay to act out. For example, you could say, "I know you're mad that mommy and daddy don't live together anymore, and it's okay to be mad, but it's not okay to hit your sister."
So you separate the emotion from the action, you validate the feeling, but you're clear about what's not acceptable.
Exactly. And speaking of boundaries, it's also crucial to protect your child from adult stuff, arguments, those kinds of conversations. They're not equipped to handle that, and it can be really stressful, confusing for them.
It's easy to forget that kids are always listening, even when we think they're not.
Oh, they are. So no bad-mouthing your ex in front of your child. And resist the urge to vent to them. Remember, they love both of you. And hearing one parent put down the other, that's really harmful.
Creating that safe, secure feeling for them, even with everything else going on.
You got it. And one way to do that is consistency. Predictability in their routines. We talk about how important routines are for autistic kids, but it's important for all kids, especially during times of stress.
So even though their family is changing, keeping some things the same, meal times, bedtimes, even who picks them up from school, those little things can make a big difference.
Exactly. Stability, normalcy in the middle of all the change. And you don't have to do this alone. There are tons of resources to help for you and your child. Therapists, support groups, online communities.
And there's stuff for kids too, right? Books, websites that can help them understand divorce. We'll link to some in the episode description. But before we get to that, I want to go back to something you said earlier. Divorce as a potential catalyst for growth. It's not something you hear every day, and I'm curious to explore it a bit more.
I think it's a really important conversation. And one of the things that really stuck with me from the research was a quote from an autistic adult. She described divorce as a forced awakening.
Wow, that's powerful.
Right. And she talked about how, even though it was incredibly painful, it forced her to face some things about herself, her relationships, pushed her out of her comfort zone, and ultimately helped her understand her own needs better.
It's like sometimes we need that shake-up to break free from patterns that aren't working for us anymore.
Exactly. And divorce, with all the upheaval, all the uncertainty, it can be that catalyst for change. Makes you reevaluate your priorities, your values, even your sense of self.
So it's not just about loss and grief, it's also about rediscovery, reinvention.
Exactly. And that reinvention can look different for everyone. Exploring new interests, setting new goals, or maybe just learning to prioritize your own well-being.
Taking back control, right? Shaping your life in a way that's true to who you are.
Yes. And that process of self-discovery can be so empowering. Even in the middle of a divorce, we were reading about how this idea of forced awakening can apply to the co-parenting relationship too.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, think about it. When you're not in a romantic relationship anymore, you can approach co-parenting in a more, I don't know, a more objective way. You can focus on what works, what's best for your child, without all the emotional baggage that comes with a romantic relationship.
So you're free from those expectations, resentments, things that can get in the way of good communication.
Exactly. And that can be so freeing for both of you and for your child. It allows you to create a co-parenting dynamic that's truly focused on their needs.
Putting the child first instead of getting caught up in adult drama.
You got it. And this focus on your child's well-being, it brings up another important point. Advocating for their needs, not just within the family, but in the world too. Because let's be real, there's still so much stigma around autism, and that can affect how autistic parents are seen, especially during divorce.
That's true. And it's something we definitely need to talk about. But first, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dig into the challenges and the strategies for advocating for your child, even when you're facing those societal misconceptions and biases. Okay, so we're back and ready to talk about something, well, it can be a bit tough, to be honest. We've been talking about the unique challenges you face as an autistic parent going through a divorce, and I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, those societal perceptions, the biases that can come up during this process.
Yeah, it's something we can't ignore. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of misunderstanding about autism out there, and those misconceptions can really seep into legal things, social interactions, and it's just not fair.
Right. And from what we've seen in these resources, it seems like autistic parents, mothers especially, often end up facing the brunt of these biases.
It's true. And it's sad because autistic individuals, especially women, are often hit with these stereotypes, like they're emotionally detached, they lack empathy, they can't be good parents, which just isn't true. And it can be incredibly damaging, especially in custody battles.
So you're not only dealing with the emotional fallout of the divorce itself, but you're also fighting against these assumptions that people have about you. It's an extra layer of stress, and it's just not right.
Exactly. And that's where having a strong support system is so, so important. You need people around you who get it, who understand autism, and can speak up against those misconceptions when they come up.
And that support can come from therapists, autism advocacy groups, even just online communities where you can connect with other autistic parents who've been through similar experiences.
Yes, it's about building that sense of I don't know, that sense of validation around yourself, knowing that you are a capable parent, a loving parent, no matter what other people might think. And that validation is so important for your child, too.
Right, because they need to know that their parents' autism doesn't change how much they're loved or their parents' ability to care for them, and that the things society might say about autism, those don't define who they are or what their family is.
Absolutely. Kids pick up on those things, societal attitudes, biases, even when they're little. So creating a home where their parents' autism is seen as a difference, not something negative, that's so key.
And that goes back to what we've been talking about, right? Educating others about autism, advocating for your child's needs, celebrating their strengths. It's about building that acceptance and understanding, both within your family and out in the world.
The resources we've been looking at, they really emphasize that you're not alone in this. There are so many organizations, individuals who are fighting for autistic people, for families.
That's good to hear because it can feel so lonely when you're facing those challenges.
It can. But there's power in numbers. Connecting with those communities can give you practical support and also just a sense of solidarity, belonging.
Knowing that even when things are tough, you're not alone.
Exactly. And it brings us to the core of what we've been talking about in this deep dive. Being an autistic parent going through a divorce, it's complicated. There are challenges, there's no easy answer, and the path forward might not always be clear.
That's true. But even with all that uncertainty, there's always hope. Hope for healing, for growth, for new beginnings. And by focusing on self-care, building those support systems, and speaking up for yourself and your child, you can come out of this stronger, more resilient.
Couldn't said it better. And remember, you're not just an autistic parent going through divorce. You are an individual with strengths, passions, dreams. And this new chapter, as hard as it is, it can also be a chance to rediscover those parts of yourself. Create a future that's really true to who you are.
Finding that silver lining, embracing the possibility of something better for you and your child.
Absolutely. And no matter what happens on this journey, remember, you are worthy of love, of support, of happiness. With the right resources, the right mindset, you can get through this and build a fulfilling life for yourself and your child.
That's a really important message, one we all need to hear. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot today, and we really hope it's been helpful for you.
We encourage you to check out those resources we linked in the episode description. And remember, you're not alone. There's help out there, and there is hope for a brighter future.